There are thousands of villages scattered across the hills of ancient Israel. Most of them vanished into history without leaving a single mark. They raised children, buried parents, harvested fields, and disappeared. If you had stood in Judah 700 years before Jesus was born and asked which town would one day become the center of God's greatest act in history, almost no one would have pointed to Bethlehem. Not because they had never heard of it, because there was no reason to choose it. Jerusalem was where kings ruled. Priests served, pilgrims gathered. If Israel's promised king was finally going to appear, Jerusalem seemed inevitable. But then a country prophet named Micah said something that should have sounded absurd. He didn't predict a kingdom. He didn't predict a battle. He didn't even predict a dynasty. He named a village. A tiny village. A village so small that Micah himself described it as little among the thousands of Judah. And then, nothing happened. Not next year. Not the next generation. Not even the next century. Assyria swallowed cities whole. Babylon burned Jerusalem. Persia rewrote the map. Greek became the language of the world. Entire civilizations disappeared. The ink on Micah's scroll grew older than the kingdoms around it. Here's the question almost nobody asks. Why did God tell anyone the name at all? If prophecy exists only to prove that God knows the future, naming Bethlehem seems strangely specific. But if prophecy is meant to prepare people to recognize the Messiah before he arrives, then every detail suddenly matters. Because Micah wasn't merely giving Israel information, he was leaving behind evidence. Evidence that could survive kings, outlive empires, and still waiting on the night a young couple arrived in Bethlehem looking for a place to stay. And that raises a question far bigger than Christmas. Was Bethlehem chosen because Jesus was born there, or was Jesus born there because Bethlehem had already been chosen? The name Bethlehem didn't appear in a vacuum. It appeared during one of the darkest moments in Judah's history. When Micah first spoke those words, there were no nativity scenes, no Christmas hymns, and no shepherds beneath a silent night sky. There was only fear. The northern kingdom was collapsing beneath the shadow of Assyria. Refugees arrived with stories of cities erased almost overnight. And everywhere in Judah, people were asking the same question. Will there be anything left when this is over? Into that fear stepped a prophet from the farming village of Moresheth. Not a royal advisor, not a priest from Jerusalem, but a man far more familiar with vineyards than palace halls. His message was uncomfortable. Kings abused their power. Judges accepted bribes. Prophets spoke for profit. Worship continued, but the nation's heart had drifted far from God. If you had listened to Micah preach, you would have expected his final words to be about survival, about Assyria, about Jerusalem, about whether Judah would endure. Instead, he shifted the horizon hundreds of years into the future, not to Jerusalem, to Bethlehem. That should have stopped every listener in their tracks, because prophets usually spoke about what God would do. Micah spoke about where. Hope suddenly had an address, a real place that could be found on a map and tested by history itself. And that raises an uncomfortable question. Why risk that kind of precision? If Bethlehem never mattered, Micah's prophecy would die with him. So why would God allow his prophet to be that specific? Because the story of Bethlehem didn't begin with Micah. It began centuries earlier, with a shepherd boy no one expected to become king. Here's what makes Micah's prophecy so unusual. It isn't that he predicts a coming king. Israel's prophets had spoken about that for generations. It isn't even that he connects the Messiah to David's family. That hope already stretched back to God's covenant in 2 Samuel 7. The strange part is this. Micah leaves an address. Imagine reading his prophecy the day it was written. You know the village. You've probably walked through it. You've bought grain there. You know exactly where Bethlehem is. Yet Micah gives you no date, no generation, no sign that the fulfillment is near. Just a name. Then he walks away. That raises an uncomfortable question. What were God's people supposed to do with that information? Nothing. The prophecy wasn't an instruction. It wasn't telling Israel to gather in Bethlehem. It wasn't telling families to move there. It wasn't telling priests to build an altar there. For 7 centuries, the name simply remained on the page, waiting. That's what makes this prophecy different from prediction. Predictions expire. If they fail, they're forgotten. But this wasn't written to create excitement for the next few years. It was written to become evidence for a future generation. Every child who learned Micah's words, every scribe who copied them by hand, every rabbi who reads them aloud in the synagogue, was unknowingly preserving a destination they would never live to see fulfilled. Generation after generation protected a prophecy whose purpose belonged to people they would never meet. Think about that. Most people measure God's faithfulness by what happens in their own lifetime. Micah's prophecy demanded faith from people who would die without seeing the answer. And perhaps that's the most astonishing part. God wasn't only preparing the birthplace of the Messiah, he was preparing the witnesses. Because when the child was finally born, no one would be able to say the location had been invented afterward. The address had been sitting in Israel's scriptures all along. But could a single sentence really survive 700 years without being changed, forgotten, or explained away? That question carries us into one of the most remarkable stretches of silence in the entire Bible. 700 years doesn't feel like a prophecy. It feels like abandonment. When Micah first wrote the name Bethlehem, children who heard his words grew old and died. Their children died. Then, their children's children. Generation after generation passed, and still no Messiah. History did not wait with them. Assyria came. Still no Messiah. Babylon burned Jerusalem and reduced the temple to ashes. Still no Messiah. Persia sent the exiles home and rebuilt the temple. Still no Messiah. Alexander conquered the world. Greek replaced the language of the marketplace. Still no Messiah. Then came Rome. Its legions stretched farther than any empire Israel had ever known. Caesar's image appeared on coins. Roman law governed the roads. Still no Messiah. But through every empire, one thing remained. Bethlehem. Empires rewrote borders. They changed governments, languages, and kings. Assyria destroyed cities. Babylon destroyed a temple. Greece changed the language. Rome ruled the world. Yet when Herod opened Micah's scroll, Bethlehem was still there. For 7 centuries, scribes copied the prophecy by hand, preserving a destination they would never live to see fulfilled. By the time Jesus was born, Micah's prophecy was already ancient, too old to forge, too widespread to alter, too specific to ignore. And then, without any announcement from heaven, 2 ordinary people began walking south from Nazareth. They thought they were obeying Caesar. They had no idea they were stepping into a sentence written 700 years earlier. Rome believed it was counting people. Caesar Augustus issued a decree requiring families to return to their ancestral towns. To the empire, it was nothing more than administration. But Rome thought it was counting people. God was keeping a promise. Joseph lived in Nazareth, nearly 90 miles from Bethlehem. Left alone, there is every reason to believe Jesus would have been born there. Instead, a pagan emperor unknowingly sent a carpenter and his pregnant wife to the exact village God had named 7 centuries earlier. Luke records the moment with remarkable simplicity. No dramatic announcement, no explanation that Micah's prophecy was finally unfolding, just ordinary obedience. A crowded town, a child born in Bethlehem. And then another scene unfolds. Magi arrive from the east asking a question that terrifies a king. Where was he born king of the Jews? Herod doesn't know, so he gathers the chief priests and the scribes, the men who have devoted their lives to the scriptures. They don't debate. They don't ask for time to investigate. They answer immediately. In Bethlehem of Judea. Because the answer had been waiting in the scroll of Micah for 700 years, and that may be the greatest tragedy in the entire story. The religious leaders knew the prophecy. They knew the location. What they struggled to believe wasn't where the Messiah would be born. It was who the Messiah was. People recognized the address and still missed the king. 7 centuries earlier, a prophet had written a single name, Bethlehem. Empires rose and fell around it. Assyria couldn't erase it. Babylon couldn't burn it. Greece couldn't translate it away. Rome couldn't silence it. For 700 years, generation after generation preserved a promise they would never live to see fulfilled. Because God wasn't only preparing a birthplace, he was preparing history itself. And perhaps that is the strangest part of Micah's prophecy. People can ignore a prophet. They can dismiss a promise. They can even miss a king. But they cannot change an address. And for 700 years, Bethlehem was waiting.